sense for what myths are all about. If you read, I don't know if anybody's read Faust, that's the most popular work. German literature isn't much read these days anymore, but if you ever do bother to read it and have a chance to read more of Goethe's writings, particularly things like his little fairy tale and his little novella, he is just a master of laying out the transformations of mythology. So he really has this sense that myths are about transformation. And in the stories that we'll be dealing with tonight, from The King and the Corpse, the overriding theme is of transformation. Each one of our protagonists has to undergo an ordeal, a ritual of some kind, that ends up totally transforming them. In the Jungian system, it would be regarded as the integration of the repressed side of the personality. And that's what each of these individuals has to go through. And in the book, I've chosen, I want to focus just on 4 of these stories. And the first one is the story of Abu Qasim. And then the second chapter with those 2 wonderful stories of Prince Khan Ada and St. John Chrysostom. And then I want to focus on the title story itself, The King and the Corpse. And the central character there is a king. Now, each one of these individuals has to go through a transformation process that ends up bringing up that which they have totally missed or neglected in their lives. Abu Qasim is a merchant, and so represents the point of view of the merchant class, which was known traditionally as the third estate, or the bourgeois. And Khan Ada represents the nobility, and John Chrysostom represents the point of view of the priesthood. So we have the 3 classical estates represented in these first 3 stories, and of course also the nobility and the priesthood, actually, with the king and the corpse. And these are the classical estates of high civilization. When civilization is in high form, you get this very sharp, almost, it's an almost caste-like rigidification. And this has been melting down in our civilization for the past 200 years or so, since the French Revolution, more or less. There's been this slow abolishing of the nobility and the meltdown of these 3 classical estates into what is now referred to as the 4th estate, which is simply the masses. And we've gotten rid of this hierarchical distinction that you will find in all of the traditional civilizations. And so ours is quite unique in its endeavor to depart from this classical structure. So this is the first structure that I saw emerging as I read through these stories again this time. Now, the reason I've chosen this to sort of sandwich it in between the system of Carl Jung on the one hand and Joseph Campbell's Here with a Thousand Faces on the other is that Zimmer gives us a refreshingly non-canonical, non-dogmatic point of view. He totally dispenses with the whole theory of the Jungian archetypes. He's not interested in them at all. He certainly respects them, and is a great friend and admirer of Carl Jung. But I want to draw your attention to the introduction here, The Dilettante Among Symbols, which really synopsizes Zimmer's whole point of view with respect to this material. He says, if we are going to enter into these stories with a preconception about what we think we're going to find, we're not going to be speaking with mythology in a living sense. Mythology is something that is alive. It will turn out to be sort of cookie molding all the little patterns into these neat little slots. If you do that, you already know what the myths are all about, and you're cutting yourself short. And he says this is an old way to intellectual frustration. Now, he also has a dig here at the traditionalists. His Heinrich Zimmer, he said, the only man who ever gave me an inferiority complex was Ananda K. Kumaraswamy. And Kumaraswamy was the great Hindu interpreter of this great esoteric system. Kumaraswamy was a master. He knew what all the stories meant. He knew what all the traditional references of all the myths and symbols in India were. And he would publish these papers, and they would be buried in these obscure journals. And Zimmer would read them and just be impressed by them. But the difference between Coomaraswamy's approach and that of the East generally is that there is to be no departure in the Eastern interpretation from tradition. You are not allowed to, the guru is not interested in what the myths and tales have to say to you. It is you simply receiving tradition and carrying it on. But Zimmer comes out of this Western love of challenging one's authorities, of being critical of one's masters. And so we have developed a Western tradition that is entirely critical of our authorities. The guru or teacher and the disciple is not just somebody who comes along and spouts off what the master has said, but like, for example, with the relationship between Nietzsche and Wagner, Nietzsche was Wagner's disciple for a very long time, and their relationship ends at the moment that Nietzsche begins to form himself and his own opinions. And as we saw with Freud and Jung, it's basically the same thing. That type you will see repeating itself through the entire intellectual history of the West. The student grows up and becomes critical of the master and analyzes that system so that he or she can then find their own voice through the imitation. It's a little bit like the great master painters. If you ever look, just pick up any synopsis of the paintings of a particular individual, like say all the paintings of Edward Hopper or all the paintings of Van Gogh or what have you, and look at the early paintings and you will find that in each case the artist begins by imitating the masters that have just recently come before him. Edward Hopper begins, for example, by imitating the paintings of the Impressionists, and it takes him a while, but he eventually finds his own style through that imitation. Picasso, at the age of 16, is already painting these very finished works of art that are fit to rank with the best of the Impressionists. He's already mastered that, and moving on then toward these new innovative transformations. And so that Zimmer embodies really the Western mentality toward this material, and not that Carl Jung does not, because Jung certainly came up with his own ideas and went on his own quest. It is just that Jung's approach is very systematic in contradistinction to this relaxed, informal, almost dinner conversation style of Heinrich Zimmer's dialogue.
But Jung was really looking for something that he wanted to see in it.
Yes.
Too.
Yes.
I mean, it's almost not even comparable.
Right. So that's Zimmer's approach here in the beginning. Now, so the first story then is Abu Qasim's slippers, and I thought what we would do is just recount the story briefly, and then I'll recount a few things that Zimmer discusses about each of the stories, and then I'd like to hear from you guys and what you think about the stories in the spirit of Zimmer's idea that we should dialogue with these things. They shouldn't be just dead little artifacts to be collected on a shelf somewhere. Myths, after all, are produced out of the body. They are rooted in what the Hindus call the Vijnana Maya Kosha. And the Vijnana Maya Kosha means the sheath made of wisdom. And the wisdom sheath is what brings the grass up out of the soil. It's what brings the trees up out of the earth. It's what brings the baby out of the mother's womb. And it is what brings the myths up out of the psyche. And so these things are alive. And as such, even though these are ancient tales, they should still have something to say to us if they are true myths. Now, the word myth itself is actually etymologically related to the word mouth. And it is so because it has to do with the passing on. Myths originally were orally transmitted. They were spoken and passed on. And traditionally, the details are kept very, very, just like with the Hindus, there's no departure from the details of the story. And the master singers and the bards of Homeric Greece or the sages, the rishis of India, would have to learn these things and transmit them orally. And it is only in very late traditions that you finally get written versions of these things. By the time we have the Homeric epics, for example, the Odyssey and the Iliad, these are already very ancient stories that have been passed around orally. And Homer is simply someone who, if he did indeed exist and is not legendary, is who simply committed these things to writing. As the case is the same also with the Hindus. Vyasa was supposed to be the legendary person who captured the Mahabharata and wrote it down. But he's inheriting this huge oral tradition. So we have these texts. These are all folk tales, the stories that we're dealing with, and by the time we get them committed to print, they have already been passed around. So the first story then is Abu Qasim's slippers, and the story goes that Abu Qasim is a rich merchant who is actually a miser, and he doesn't want to appear in the least bit rich, and he refuses to change his shoes. And they're these big, floppy, old, moth-eaten slippers, and he has threaded them and patched them up, and he simply refuses to change them.